My name is Eleanor Whitcombe. I am 67 years old. Let me start with the foreclosure notice. Not because the foreclosure notice is where the story ends. The story does not end at a foreclosure notice. But the foreclosure notice is the specific moment when 7 years of a very particular kind of silence became something else. And I want you to understand what that something else felt like from the perspective of a 67-year-old woman who had been waiting for exactly this kind of phone call, without ever wanting to be right about it coming. The call came on a Thursday morning in March, 14 months ago. I was in my kitchen in Raleigh, North Carolina, making oatmeal because my doctor had told me the previous year to eat more oatmeal and because I had decided that 77 was too old to argue with doctors. My grandson Oliver was 7 years old, and I had not seen him since he was 11 months old. That is the specific number I carry with me everywhere. 11 months. My daughter-in-law's name is Kayla. She and my son David have been married for 10 years. She called me at 8:43 in the morning, and her voice had the specific quality of someone who has been awake since before the sun came up, and who has been dreading a phone call, and who has made the phone call anyway because the alternative to the phone call is worse than the phone call. She said, "Eleanor." I said, "Kayla." She said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen before you say anything." I said, "All right." She said, "We got a foreclosure notice yesterday, on the house. We're 4 months behind and the bank filed and David doesn't know I'm calling you and I don't know what to do." I sat down in the kitchen chair. She said, "I know I don't have the right to ask you anything. I know what I did. I know you know what I did. But Oliver could lose his home, and I don't know where else to turn." I said, "Tell me the specific number." She told me. I said, "Is David working?" She said, "Yes. But we had some things happen last year, medical things, and we fell behind and we couldn't catch up." I said, "Is Oliver all right?" She said, and her voice changed in the specific way that a mother's voice changes when someone asks about her child. "Yes. He's fine. He doesn't know anything is wrong." I said, "Good." There was a very specific silence on the phone. She said, "Eleanor, I know you could just say no. You would have every right to say no." I said, "Kayla, I'm not going to say no." She said, "Why not?" I said, "Because Oliver is my grandson and his home matters, and because the right thing is the right thing, regardless of everything else." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I owe you more than an apology." I said, "Yes, you do. But that is a conversation for a different day. Today we solved the foreclosure problem. Before I take you to the beginning and the specific evening 7 years ago, when Kayla told me I was no longer welcome in my grandson's life, let me tell you one thing about that Thursday morning in March. After I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen with the oatmeal going cold on the stove, I thought about what a 77-year-old friend of mine named Rosalind had said to me once, when I was telling her about Oliver and what Kayla had done. Rosalind had listened to the whole story, and then she had said, "Eleanor, the thing about grandchildren is that they have a way of bringing people to the truth eventually. Children always do. You just have to be patient enough to be there when the truth arrives." I had been patient for 7 years. The truth arrived with a foreclosure notice. I grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina, the oldest of 3 daughters born to Harold and Ruth Whitcombe, who had spent 41 years married and who had built the specific kind of life that people build when they are both deeply practical and deeply loving, a combination that is rarer than it sounds. My father was an accountant who had his own small practice in Greensboro for 33 years. He was a man of specific and particular precision about everything, the kind of precision that extends from the professional into the personal, and that produces someone who is simultaneously exacting and deeply fair. He was not warm in the performed sense, but he was warm in the specific and reliable sense of someone whose behavior was entirely consistent with his love. My mother was a high school mathematics teacher who communicated everything that mattered through the specific mechanism of making things. She sewed, she cooked, she gardened, she built things alongside my father in the workshop at the back of the house, and everything she made had the particular quality of someone who understood that the making was the language she spoke most fluently. I married Robert Whitcombe at 24, a man I had met at a church social in Greensboro and who had the particular combination of my father's precision and my mother's warmth that I had apparently been looking for without knowing I was looking for it. Robert spent his career as a structural engineer. We had 2 children, David, born when I was 27, and Patricia, born when I was 30. Robert died 8 years ago, at 63, of pancreatic cancer. The dying was fast in the specific way that pancreatic cancer is sometimes fast, from diagnosis to the end in 7 months, and the 7 months had the particular quality of a long goodbye that is also a rushing goodbye, and that leaves you with the specific combination of having said most of what needed to be said and knowing that there was more. David was 32 when his father died. He had been married to Kayla for 2 years. Kayla was 29, a marketing coordinator at a firm in Charlotte, where David and she had settled after their wedding. She was warm to me in the specific way that daughters-in-law are warm to mothers-in-law, when the marriage is still new and the positioning is still being established. Patricia was 29 when her father died, and she lived in Portland, Oregon with her husband Marcus and their 2 daughters who are now 11 and 8, and who I see 4 times a year, and who are the particular ordinary ongoing joy of grandchildren who are present in your life, in the way grandchildren are supposed to be present. Oliver was born 2 years after Robert died. I drove to Charlotte when Kayla went into labor, and I waited in the hospital with the particular patience of a grandmother waiting for the specific news that changes everything. When David came out to the waiting room and said he was here and he was perfect, I cried in the particular complete way of someone who has been waiting for something very good, and who receives it fully. Oliver James Whitcombe, 6 pounds, 14 ounces. Dark hair like David and eyes that we couldn't tell yet. I held him that first afternoon, and he looked up at me with the specific, unfocused attention of a newborn encountering the world, and I said quietly, to no one in particular, "Hello, Oliver. I've been waiting for you." Kayla was watching from the bed, and she smiled, genuinely, in that moment. Whatever came later, that smile was real. I want to tell you about the 11 months between Oliver's birth and the evening Kayla told me I was no longer welcome, because the 11 months matter, and because what happened in them is more complicated than a simple story of a grandmother being pushed out. I helped. Genuinely and substantially. When Oliver was 6 weeks old, Kayla went back to work, and the specific childcare arrangements they had made fell through because the daycare they had selected had a waiting list that turned out to be longer than expected. I drove to Charlotte for 6 weeks, Monday through Friday, to care for Oliver while the child care situation was resolved. I stayed in their guest room. I fed and bathed and walked and rocked Oliver through 6 weeks of early infancy, and it was the particular exhausted joy that caring for an infant produces in someone who loves the infant completely. I also, in that 6-week period, offered to help with the financial pressure of the childcare situation. Not as a loan, as a grandmother's contribution to a grandchild. I paid for 2 months of the daycare when it was finally arranged, the specific months when the expense was highest, and I paid off their house. I want to describe this specifically because the specifics matter. Robert had left me well provided for. The house was paid off, the insurance was substantial, and the specific investments he had built across 30 years of careful engineering work had produced the particular financial security that I had not expected to need at 63, and that I was grateful for, and that I understood as a resource to be used for the people I loved, rather than simply accumulated. David and Kayla's mortgage was significant, and their monthly payments were the specific financial pressure point of a young couple in Charlotte with a new baby and one income temporarily reduced by maternity leave. When I looked at their situation and at my own resources, the calculation was straightforward. I paid off the mortgage, not as a loan, as a gift. I had my attorney draw up the paperwork to make it a clean transfer with no expectations attached. I told David and Kayla what I intended to do, and they both said yes. Kayla cried. She hugged me and said she didn't know what to say, and I said, "You don't need to say anything. It's just what grandmothers do when they can." That was in April of Oliver's first year. By October of Oliver's first year, something had changed. I want to describe this change accurately because I think the accuracy is more useful than either the simplified version where Kayla is simply the villain or the simplified version where I did something specific to cause it. What changed was the specific dynamic of Kayla's relationship with her own mother. Kayla's mother, whose name is Brenda, had not been close to Kayla across most of Kayla's adult life. The particular distance between a mother and daughter that sometimes develops and that both parties have contributed to. When Oliver was born, something shifted. Brenda came to Charlotte for the first 2 weeks after the birth. She and Kayla spent more time together in those weeks than they had in years. Something between them reopened. By the time Oliver was 6 months old, Brenda was visiting Charlotte regularly. She and Kayla had rebuilt something between them. This was genuinely good, and I want to say that clearly. Whatever else happened, a mother and daughter rebuilding a relationship is genuinely good. What became complicated was the specific mathematics of grandparental access in a household that was managing 2 competing grandmothers, and the particular internal pressure of a new mother who was working full-time and whose primary emotional support was newly her own mother again after years of distance. I visited once a month. I had always visited once a month, which was the specific arrangement that David and I had discussed and that Kayla had agreed to. Brenda, by the time Oliver was 7 months old, was visiting every 2 weeks. I noticed the difference in how my visits were received. Not dramatically, not in any single incident, but in the particular accumulated texture of visits where the warmth was slightly less than it had been, where the specific ease of the early months had become something more managed. I did not address this directly. This is a thing I want to say honestly about my own choices. I noticed, and I chose not to address it because I did not want to create conflict, and because I told myself that the dynamic would settle as Oliver got older, and as Kayla found her footing as a new mother. I was wrong not to address it. The not addressing allowed the specific thing that was building to build without any intervention. The evening in November, when Oliver was 11 months old, was a Tuesday. I had driven to Charlotte for my monthly visit. I had been there for 2 days. On the Tuesday evening, after Oliver was in bed and David was at a work dinner, Kayla sat down across from me at the kitchen table, and she said the specific thing she had evidently been preparing to say. She said, "Eleanor, I need to talk to you about the visits." I said, "All right." She said, "I think it would be better if the visits were less frequent, maybe every few months instead of every month." I said, "Can you tell me why?" She said, "I just think it would be better for everyone to have more space." I said, "For everyone, or for a specific someone?" She said, "Eleanor." I said, "Kayla." "I'm asking because I'd like to understand what's actually happening. We agreed to monthly visits, and that has been the arrangement, and now you're telling me it should change, and I'd like to understand what specifically has changed." She said, "I just think it's a lot." I said, "A lot for whom?" She said, and this is where the conversation became the specific conversation it had been building toward. My mom is more involved now, and it's been overwhelming trying to balance everything. I think it would be easier if your visits were less frequent. I said, "So Brenda visiting every 2 weeks is the right amount, and me visiting once a month is too much." She said, "That's not what I said." I said, It's what you're describing. What happened next was the particular escalation of a conversation that has reached the specific point where the thing underneath is being said rather than the thing on top. And I want to be honest that I contributed to the escalation in the specific way of someone who had been holding a feeling for several months and who, when pressed, expressed it more directly than the moment required. I said something about the house, about having paid off their mortgage, about what that should mean in terms of consideration. This was wrong of me. I want to say that clearly and without qualification. The payment of the mortgage was a gift, and gifts are not meant to purchase behavior, and saying something that suggested the gift gave me standing to demand access was the specific wrong thing to say in that specific moment. Kayla's face changed when I said it. Whatever was salvageable in the conversation became unsalvageable at that moment. She said, "I think you should go." I said, "Kayla." She said, "I think you should leave tonight, and I think the monthly visits need to stop." She said, "I don't want our family's finances to be part of a conversation about how often you see our son." She said, "And I don't think it's healthy for Oliver to have a grandmother who holds what she's given over people's heads." I drove back to Raleigh that night. David called me the following morning. He was upset in the particular way he was upset when he had received information from Kayla that had organized itself before he called me, the specific quality of someone who has heard one side of something and who is calling to communicate it. He said I had made Kayla feel like the mortgage payment was a transaction. He said she was uncomfortable with the visits. He said they needed some space. I said, "David, I said something wrong in the conversation with Kayla. I shouldn't have brought up the house. I'm sorry for that." He said, "I know, Mom." I said, "But I want you to also hear that the situation that produced that conversation was not entirely of my making." He said, "I know." He said, "We just need some time." The sometime became 7 years. I want to tell you what the 7 years looked like, because they deserve honest description. David and I maintained a relationship, careful and reduced but maintained. We spoke on the phone once a week, the particular phone calls of a mother and son navigating the specific geography of a situation where the son is positioned between his mother and his wife, and where the positioning requires a specific kind of management that costs everyone. He sent me photographs of Oliver. This was his specific kindness, the thing he could do within the constraints of the situation. Birthday photographs and Christmas photographs and first day of school photographs and the specific photographs of a child growing up that a grandmother should be present for, but that arrived through a phone screen instead. Kayla and I did not speak, not because of a formal agreement, because the conversation we had needed to be different from the conversation we had had, and neither of us knew how to begin a different conversation, and so neither of us began one. Oliver grew. I knew him through photographs. I want to tell you something about what those 7 years produced in me, because I think the honest account requires it. They produced a very specific kind of grief. Not the acute grief of a sudden loss, but the particular chronic grief of an absence that is ongoing and that you cannot resolve, because the resolution requires the participation of people who are not ready to participate. I went to therapy. I spoke with my priest, I called Rosalind and other friends, and I processed the grief in the specific ways that grief requires being processed. I also, across those 7 years, did not say anything to anyone that would make the situation worse, or make Oliver feel, when he was old enough to understand anything, that the adults in his life had been at war. I sent birthday cards. I sent Christmas cards. I sent the specific cards that grandmothers send when they cannot be present, with the particular messages that say, "I love you and I think of you," without making the child feel the weight of the adult situation they have been placed in the middle of. I kept every receipt of every card I sent, not because I was building a case, because the record is the record and keeping it accurately was the honest thing to do. I want to tell you about the Thursday morning in March, the foreclosure call, with the particular specificity it deserves. After I told Kayla I wasn't going to say no, we talked for 40 minutes. She told me the specific situation. David had been laid off 8 months ago and had found a new position, but at a lower salary. And the gap between the two had produced the particular compounding difficulty of falling behind and not being able to catch up. And a medical issue with Oliver that I didn't know about had added costs that pushed them further behind. And by the time the bank filed, they were in a specific hole that felt impossible. I said, "Oliver had a medical issue?" She said, "Last spring. An appendix situation. He's completely fine now." I said, "Kayla." She said, "I know. I should have told you." I said, "Yes." She said, "I didn't know how to call you." I said, "I know." She said, "Eleanor. How are you calling me back right now without being angry?" I thought about this. I said, "I am angry. In the specific way that someone is angry when they have missed 7 years of a grandchild's life that they should not have missed. I am genuinely angry about that, and I want you to know I am." She said, "Yes." I said, "And I'm also a 67-year-old grandmother who wants to see her grandson before she gets too old to chase him around a yard. And Oliver is 7 years old, and his home is being foreclosed and he doesn't know anything is wrong. Those things are more important than my anger today." She said nothing for a moment. She said, "I need to tell you something." I said, "Tell me." She said, "What you said that night. About the house. About what you had given us." I said, "I was wrong to say it." She said, "Yes. But I also know why you said it. And I've known for 7 years that the reason you said it was because I had been making you feel like your visits were an imposition, and you finally said it back." I said, "Yes." She said, "I was wrong too." "I was wrong before you were wrong." I said, "Yes, you were." She said, "I don't know how to undo 7 years." I said, "You can't undo them. You can start from now." She said, "Can you do that?" I said, "I can try." She said, "Eleanor, Oliver knows who you are. He's seen the photographs David has. He knows he has a grandma in Raleigh who sends him cards." I said, "He does?" She said, "He has every card you've ever sent him. He keeps them in a box in his room. He asked me once if he was ever going to meet you. I sat with this for the specific time it required. I said, "What did you tell him?" She said, "I told him yes. I told him that grandmothers and grandchildren always find each other eventually." I said, "You told him that?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Even when you weren't speaking to me?" She said, "Even then. Because I knew it was true and because he deserved to believe it." I said, "That was the right thing to tell him." She said, "I know. I dealt with the foreclosure. The specific financial mechanics took 2 weeks to work through with the bank and with David and Kayla's attorney. The particular careful work of someone who has been an engineer's wife for 30 years and who understands that the precise number matters and that the process matters and that getting both right is what produces the right outcome. The house was saved. The foreclosure was stopped. Oliver did not know anything had been wrong. I want to tell you about the first time I saw Oliver after 7 years, because it is the specific moment that everything in this story was building toward. Kayla had asked if I would come to Charlotte in May. She had asked carefully, the particular carefulness of someone who understood that what she was asking was significant and who was not taking it for granted. I drove to Charlotte on a Saturday morning in May. Oliver was in the backyard when I arrived, the specific backyard of the house I had never seen because it had been built after the years of the estrangement. He was playing with the particular focused absorption of a 7-year-old who is in the middle of something important and who has not yet registered that a car has arrived. Kayla had told him the night before that his grandma Eleanor was coming. He knew I was coming. He saw me come around the side of the house and he stopped what he was doing and he looked at me with the specific concentrated attention of a child who is encountering something he has been thinking about. He said, "Are you my grandma Eleanor?" I said, "Yes." "I am." He said, "I have your cards." I said, "I know. Your mom told me." He said, "I have all of them." I said, "That makes me very happy." He said, "How come I never met you before?" I looked at Kayla, who was standing on the back porch with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. I said, "Because sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and then it takes a long time to fix them." He said, "Did you make a mistake?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Did my mom make a mistake?" I said, "That's something you should ask her about someday when you're older." He thought about this with the particular seriousness of a 7-year-old processing something significant. Then he said, "Do you want to see what I'm building?" I said, "Yes. I would like that very much." He showed me a small wooden structure he was making with pieces of leftover wood from the garage, the particular creative construction of a child who has inherited something from someone, and I thought of Robert in his workshop and of the way David had spent hours in that workshop as a boy, and I understood that what Oliver was doing in his backyard was the specific continuation of something that had been going in our family for 3 generations. I said, "Your grandfather Robert would have loved to see this." He said, "Who is grandfather Robert?" I said, "My husband, your dad's dad. He died before you were born. He was an engineer. He built things." Oliver said, "Like me?" I said, "Just like you." He said, "Cool." He went back to building. I sat in the backyard of the house I had helped save from foreclosure, and I watched my grandson build something in the May sunshine, and Kayla brought me a cup of coffee and sat beside me, and we did not say very much, but the specific quality of what we did not say was different from the 7 years of what we had not said, because this particular silence was the silence of 2 people who have arrived somewhere they have both been trying to get to and who are allowing themselves to simply be there. Here is what 7 years of birthday cards sent to a child I couldn't see, and 1 foreclosure notice and a May morning in a backyard taught me. I know that holding a gift over someone's head is wrong even when you are hurt, and even when the feeling that produced the wrong thing was a legitimate feeling. What I said to Kayla that November evening was wrong, and I have known it was wrong since the drive back to Raleigh that night. Wrong things do not become right because the person who said them was also wronged. Both things can be true, and both were true. I know that grandchildren find their way to the truth about their families in the particular patient way that children find their way to truths, through the specific accumulated evidence of what the adults around them do and don't do, and that Oliver keeping every card I had ever sent him in a box in his room was the specific evidence of a child who understood something about what those cards meant, even before he had the vocabulary to say what he understood. I know that Kayla telling Oliver that grandmothers and grandchildren always find each other eventually, saying it even when she was not speaking to me, was the specific, honest act of a mother who understood that her son's relationship with his grandmother mattered more than the adult situation they were in, and that this act tells me something true about Kayla that the 7 years of estrangement does not cancel. And I know that Oliver is 7 years old and that he builds things in his backyard, and that he has his grandfather Robert's hands and my son David's eyes, and the particular, complete, specific, wonderful quality of himself that is all his own, and that I am 67 years old, and that I have the particular, urgent gratitude of someone who understands that the time she has is the time she has, and who is not going to waste it. I drive to Charlotte once a month. Oliver shows me what he is building. That is what grandmothers and grandchildren are for. That is my story. 11 months of a grandson's life, and then 7 years of birthday cards. A foreclosure notice on a Thursday morning. A telephone call between 2 women who both had things to say and who finally said them. And a 7-year-old in a backyard asking, "Do you want to see what I'm building?" If this reminded you of something you kept faith with across years that felt impossible, I want to hear from you. Drop it in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to know that grandmothers and grandchildren always find each other eventually. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.